Welcome everyone to the National Science Policy Network's workshop on scientific illustration, hosted by the Public Engagement and Science Communication Committee. If you're not familiar with NSPN or our Science Communication Committee, we help develop and support early career scientists. And one way we do so is by developing skills or resources for scientists to communicate their science or science policy stories in a more complete way. And so today's workshop is titled Visual Science, prompted by a scientific illustrator, and it will progress in two parts. Part one being an introduction to science illustration, and there will be a chance for audience questions, so feel free to unmute yourselves or drop questions in the chat. And part two will be a live demo. And so today's event will be led by an illustrator, animator, and designer, George Retseck. And so today I will go ahead and briefly introduce George and then let him take the stage. So George, since 1986, has illustrated for Scientific American, Scientific American Mind, and online magazines, creating scientific and technology illustrations, infographics, maps, globes, cover art, and animations. He coordinates information between art directors, science authors, and editorial staff to illustrate a wide variety of scientific subject matter, such as astronomy, biology, climate, and geology. More recently, since 2011, he began illustrating for The Scientist magazine and Modus Operandi, which delves deeply into biology and medical sciences. His work also spans a commissioned mural that he created at the entranceway of the Monell Science Center in Philadelphia, depicting the center's studies of taste and smell. So George studied communication design from Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, and he has long considered illustrating for science as a continually rewarding, interesting, and evolving field. And so thank you so much for being here today and sharing your experience, and I'll let you take the stage.
Oh, thank you, Anastasia. It's great to be here. Yeah, listening to all that, it's been a long and fun road. You know, when I was in high school, I was big in art, but I didn't know that there was any jobs in art. And when I started working for magazines, I realized, you know, first, going to art school, I realized that everything you see, somebody had to make it. And so when, I got into working for magazines, and I was lucky enough to get into the science magazines, and although I didn't go to a school there's, science graphic schools now. There wasn't when I went to school, but I was lucky enough to get into magazines where it's different subject matter like every month. It's just the gamut of things. And so it's been, really great to learn as we go, depending on whatever the subject was. The techniques have changed a lot. When I first started, everything was pen and ink, and then airbrush came, and color was like a big deal. Things are so much more powerful now with the computer graphics. And another thing, I was inspired. I went to the Science March a few years ago, and one of the speakers was talking about how there's this disconnect between the public and scientific research. And, so many of the people that are like deny certain things of the climate or don't understand medicine, I think a lot of it originates in the scientific field is so technical, and for the general public to understand what's going on, it's really hard to bridge that gap. And that's kind of like, in a small way, I figure I want to contribute to that communication. If we can take ideas, that are discovered in the lab and bring them out to the general public, I mean, that's what really needs to happen. With that in mind, here's some graphics that my stepson created for his thesis. And he uses, I don't know these programs, but he uses GStat, Matplotlib. I mean, I'm not sure if any of you use these programs, but if you're doing research papers, maybe they're the same ones. But they're really great for data, and it's what we need to get started as far as graphics people. And so when it comes to, these kind of graphs and stuff, it gives us the basis for starting an illustration, but we have to make it friendlier for the general public to consume, if that's where we're going with it. That being said, it's really important that you're communicating to your audience. And if your job is that where you're going to be communicating with people in the science field all the time, these programs are probably all you need. But if you're, trying to get grants, you're trying to get published into a more widespread magazine, the research paper that's 50 pages or 100 pages has to be boiled down to 6 or 8 pages to go out into the general public. So it's always a tough nut to crack, is to boil down years of research and important research into a nutshell that can be communicated to people. And then if they're really interested, they can get more into it. But we need to present a concise story that people can consume. So a lot of times when I get a story, it'll be from an author and it'll be something like this. This is what we would get. Probably something like this, a 2D design would be plenty. And this is a story from Scientific American. And let's see, where's my, and so here's the 2D drawings that were accomplished for it. And let's see, move things around here a little bit. Oh, that's better. Okay. So you're probably, pretty familiar with seeing something like this, but this is very nice 2D design. Our Jen Christensen, who is the infographic director at Scientific American, she does these in-house, and they're all Illustrator. They're what we would call flat art, because it doesn't have a lot of shading and dimension to it, but we're trying to communicate, and it's all you need to show what's going on. Let's see, the nice thing with Illustrator, and why I think it'd be a good tool in your toolbox, is because it's live art. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to edit it and to make changes. With science, a lot of things are changing. We go through several rounds when we're doing a story. So once things are shown, a lot of times there's input by 6 or 7 people, before it's going to be published. And so things will get moved around. Usually, I think things get better and better. Sometimes they don't, but most of the time, as you go through the processes, things get clearer, and ideas are put in, and it gets improved. So that's nice 2D design. It's a nice step up from the graphics programs that scientists use on a daily basis. And then this is basically same kind of thing, but done with a 3D program. So it's for magazines, it's probably fine. For general purposes, I don't think you need to go into making things look, that, kind of nuanced. But, with the magazine, they are willing to go to that level. So that's, like the next stage. But like I say, Illustrator, I think with the flat art is like the next first step. If you're used to using a science program like, GStat or Matplotlib. Okay. Then the next thing I wanted to talk about was like a 3D assignment. And you may want to get into a 3D program. It might be something you're interested in. The nice thing with 3D is once you have models built, you can go into video. Some things are not so well explained as a static piece. Some things need to move around. I don't think that many things need to be moved around, but sometimes they do. And when you want to do that, then video can be a good thing. But before we get to that stage, 3D is very popular as a way to make a really, exciting drawing for publication. This is some scrap art that we got for a story on El Nino and La Nina. And it's something that's, it's not new science so much, but it's something that we're affected by a lot. And so there was a lot of things already done for it. So sometimes we're not, inventing the wheel, but we're taking things that have been done before and then trying to show a little bit more, try to show it a little bit better. The art director gave me this sketch of how they wanted to communicate this information. And we wanted to do a 3D view because we thought that we had some ideas we wanted to present in a 3D fashion. I started out with a first sketch like this. So we had some technical computer generated maps, and with the 3D program, I was able to lay them down in a flat map of the world. So we're into that stage. And then the second round was a bit more developed. We put in kind of warm zones and cool zones, showing where the oceans react and how that affects the clouds. And then it gets changed, different color combinations. The nice thing with working on a computer is being able to save things in a million different ways. So I'll end up with like probably 100 files from a simple drawing like this, and just files for maps, files for bump maps that create like a texture to show what's going on, with the map. Different information comes in and out. So if you can save things in a really organized manner, it's really helpful. So, you'll be saving author's scrap. You'll be saving your initial sketches. You'll be saving your first round, second round, and finish. And then a lot of times, even when things are finished, things get changed again. And so I think if you're working with a publisher, realize that things will get changed quite a bit and just roll along with it.
George, Gavin,
yeah.
I was just going to ask, when you're saying the 3D program, like, is this all with Illustrator?
No, now we're looking at a 3D program called Lightwave.
Okay.
Yeah. So what will happen though is I'll use Illustrator like to make these arrows. I'll use Illustrator, and then I will take those lines into the 3D program, extrude them, and and make use that to help make my model. So and then I'll use Photoshop as well. The little warm and cool areas on the map, they're done in Photoshop. So all these basically most jobs that I do, I'll use 3 programs. Start with Illustrator, right, go into 3D, maybe use some Photoshop involved in the 3D, but then even when the 3D is done, I'll do a good amount of Photoshopping on that, so I think like even these little rain clouds and that kind of stuff, there's Photoshop work that goes into that.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, and then the final, when I deliver things, there's no type on them normally. The reason being is that the magazine, because things are changing constantly, they want to have a uniform typeface and uniform sizes throughout the whole magazine. So sometimes I'll put type on, but it's mainly just a placeholder, and they will put the type on and do the finished thing. And so here's the finished thing as it appeared in the magazine. And they even switched the order of the things after I handed it in, which is like totally fine, but it's they put the neutral on top and then the El Nino and then the La Nina. So it's always fun to see what happens. Okay, let's see. All right, so we talked about the scientific programs and we talked about Illustrator, Photoshop. The other thing is that I've been using Adobe. It's basically what I started with, but there's a lot of programs. My daughter's using Procreate, and I think there's a lot of other programs now. There's definitely a lot of other 3D programs, but it's best to kind of feel your way and see what you like. But the main thing is that the vector program is anything where the program is basically a recipe for the drawing. And so with an Illustrator piece, it's the basic recipe for the artwork is it tells how big the little circle is, what color it is, where the lines go, from one point to another. And so the vector program, it's very editable because you can change that recipe anytime along the way. And it doesn't take a lot of memory, which is great for sending things back and forth. And it's really good with type because it's very precise. So Illustrator is really good that way. There are other programs out there that are vector-based programs, and that's what I think is like the best thing to start with. And let's see what else do I want to say about. Yeah, I think that's it. As far as the edited, it's editable, and it's clear, and that's a great way to start. Now, as far as other programs, I'm not sure what are the competing programs right now for Illustrator, but you can get a free trial of Illustrator or the whole suite to see, to try it out and see how it goes. But then let's see, the Photoshop is like the next thing. I take a lot of things from Illustrator into Photoshop and do shading, and they really can kind of all work together, to complete a project. So we talked about folders a little bit. Basically, when you're doing your naming of your artwork, you kind of want to keep everything in order. So, like you don't want to say, well, like the new, molecule or anything like that. You want to make sure you've got a number system involved, like O1, O2, O3, depending on what it is. So you can get to the latest thing quickly and organize your folders where you have images and your different stages of your progress through the assignment. Okay, so okay, the other thing is the formats. With Photoshop is the .psd. The nice thing with Photoshop is it has all these layers, and you can you can cycle through all your drawing in different layers. Like you could have all the red things on one level, you could have all the blue things on one level, that type of thing. So if you had to quickly change things, you can do it. And so you want to save all your things that you have on layers. So that's like as much as you can make Photoshop into a live program like Illustrator is. So there's quite a bit of ability in Photoshop to make changes, but you have to make sure you save all the different things in different stages. And so, yeah, the .psd would be where you would save things in Photoshop. When you hand things in, you would do it as a JPEG or a .png, and that's a flat piece of art. Basically, it's like a dead piece at that point. You're not going to make changes to that. So, and it's not like it's going to get changed accidentally either. So it's a good way. With the 3D, there's light wave objects and light wave scenes. I'll go into, let's see, here's the this is the 3D program, and this is basically the little model that we did that one piece with, and we mapped different things on this just simple square piece. And so this is the model that was created. I used the same model for each drawing, just to change the arrows a little bit. This is the same model, but it's repeated, and there's like two parts of a 3D program. There's the modeling part and then the scene part. And the scene is basically, think of like a photo studio. And so anything that you modeled, you bring it into the photo studio. You have lights, that you can move around. You have a camera that you can move around. You have different surfaces that you can put on all your things. Like, so when you were modeling, you were constantly naming everything with different names. And so everything on there, every little piece of that 3D is a different name. And then there's mapping going on here. So the map that's on there is, let's see, let me get one out. Let's see if we can move that a little bit. Okay, so here in the surface editor, we're mapping on over here onto one of these panels. And so, and that's another thing, you can change it. If the art director wants to change colors, you can just put another map in there. And so there's a lot of editing that goes on. It gets a little more complicated and a little bit more of a little more technical with the 3D, but it's there is a lot of editable things you can do as well. Let's see. I think. Oh, and then I think lastly, if there's something that involves movement, you can take your 3D program, or you can rent a program like through Adobe Creative Suite called After Effects, and you can create a movie. I did a little portion of this. I didn't do the whole thing. I'll show you when my part comes in. But it's a Cells in Motion, it's called. Was something we did for the scientist. So I'll just let that go. This is all done in After Effects, what you're seeing right now, as far as whether pictures that are brought in from the authors, and then the type is all After Effects. So this is the part that I did. These are little models that I made in Lightwave. And we basically have to show how friction within these cells creates stretching and compaction of the cells. So, basically there's so many tools that you can get. You could do this from your home laptop, really, so if you want to spend the time, you can rent these programs. I own Illustrator and Photoshop and Lightwave when they were doing it that way. Now you get a subscription. But it's really nice because there's all these great, powerful programs, and there's tutorials all over the internet and through the programs that show you how to use these things, and just kind of see what your audience is, who you have to communicate with, and then try to come out with a way that you want to communicate. I think since we talked about Illustrator, before I take questions, we'll just do a quick little tutorial on some of the basics, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. And
okay.
If anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Yeah, if anybody wants to have a question, just hop in, especially with when we were doing these things, because there's a lot of the little things that you do when you're learning these programs. There are a lot of simple answers, but if you don't know them, you can really spend a lot of time going in circles. So basically, here's the toolbox, and it's got all these great little things in, little pointers, pens, type tools, things to make circles, things to make lines, things to make lines wider and thinner, blending tools, more blending tools, eyedroppers, all kinds of cool stuff. So it basically just line control. When you start making lines, I can hit shift and it's a straight line. Then there's tools where you can take that line and then bend it. Okay. You can go back and add to it. I don't know what we want to make, but you can just see now if you can connect it then. And then once it's connected, you can fill it. And then you can color it. I'm clicking on this little box and bringing up a color palette, picking out any color you want. Get something a little brighter. There we go. And so there's a basic shape. I mean, we could do a molecule. If we hold the shift button with this ellipse tool, it makes a perfect circle, or we can just freehand it and make a little more of an oval. Another cool thing is gradients. So it's real sensitive as far as like what's picked out and what's not. So like if I click on that thing and then it's live, then that's live and that's live. So if whatever you click on, that's what's going to be active that you can work on. So it doesn't bother the other things if you want to work on something. Now I just put a gradient on that. There's a little thing right here that I just hit and I put a gradient on it. That's a linear gradient. I want a radial one. And then there's a little tool that you can affect that gradient and move it around. Make it more of an oval if you want. You know, maybe you've got some cells to do or something and you gotta, you know, come up with some kind of spiffy way to show those. So you can play around with these till your heart's content. And then once you click off of that, that's what it is. But it's editable, so you can go back and do it again. You know, it's a very forgiving program that way because it's not once and done. With Photoshop, it's a little more once and done. You know, you're going to be using a pen tool or something and shading by hand, and you know, you can Command Z your way out of things, but and then you have a few steps you can go back and redo things. But Illustrator is definitely the most friendly tool as far as being able to make changes. See, as far as type goes, you have the type tool here. I'll make it a little bigger so we can see it. Here's the character little dialog box. Make it a little bigger, and then whoop. Okay, so then your program will come with like a zillion different typefaces, and that's all in the character box there. You know, with science, I think old school here, you want to like Helvetica is a great one for science, and nobody's going to have a hard time with that. There's a lot of ugly typefaces you want to stay away from, but Helvetica is a really good one to start with. And then you know, if you're going to probably want to put leaders to something. Right now I'm on a fill right here, and then I hit this little arrow and it switches it over to a line. Maybe possibly you might want an arrow on there. So over here on this stroke box, there's arrowheads, all kinds of arrowheads. And that's kind of a nice one. It's going the wrong way, so I'll hit it over here and it switches it around. Let's see. What else could we do? Oh, okay. This is, you know, maybe you're making some cell structures or something to do with geology or it's something, and you want to show some line work that has different weights to it. I'm going to just mess this up a little bit, give it, maybe it would be something we'd be working on in geology. I'm not sure, it could be anything. But you need to make the line fatter, okay? So it gives you, it's not just a static line, you can actually control the width of the line. It's almost looking like a leaf or something. So let's see what else. Oh, say you've got, you know, a bunch of different colors. And you want to repeat that, you can take this eyedropper tool and it picks up wherever you click on it, it'll pick that up. Even this gray area, it'll pick up that gradient. Let's see what else. Tons of different things. There's graphs and stuff on here too. I never use them, but there are graphs on there ready to go. So, oh, and then you can, of course, spin things. Okay, so you don't have to draw it all over again if it needs to be spun a little bit. If you need to copy it, or reflect it, right here, I'm going to hit the Option key, click, and then you can reflect it different ways. So we just reflected that same shape, didn't have to draw it over again. Sizing tools. So you can make something smaller. You know, if the editor or the magazine says, oh, we don't have room for that, can you make it smaller? Easy to do. There's freehand drawing tools. Which kind of starts to get you into the Photoshop area. But the thing with these is that they lay down little dots all along the way. And so you can edit that line that you just freehand drew. Oh, the other thing is helpful. Right now we're in the preview mode. And there's a thing called the work mode, and you go Command Y. And you can see all your lines that you're working with. Okay, so this is the vector, you know, those little lines, and within those lines is the recipe for the drawing. That's what you inputted. So and go back to Command Y again, and it comes back. So here's a, you know, a little that we can go on and on with showing you tools, and I can do some Photoshop, you know, little demos too. So you know, we've got a good 20 minutes left. What kind of questions do we have? And about anything, you know, like working in the field, how to get started, what kind of equipment to get, anything.
Yeah, I think it'll be, I was really fascinated when you talk about kind of like the recipe and kind of like what is live, what is not, what becomes static, what do you start to animate, and also your layering approach. Like, what are some general tips you would suggest about how you would go about layering an image that has to address like a science concept?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think let's just say we took this little mess into Photoshop. Okay. So let me move this out of the way for a second. Get that out of the way. And I'll just save that to the desktop. Okay. So I'm saving this. Got a name, untitled one. Just put it on the desktop. Normally I would put it in a folder with something that I'm working with. And now I'm going to open up Photoshop. And right now let's see, I'm going to open that up. The untitled piece we just made. Okay. That's a kind of a cool thing about Illustrator is that if you don't do anything, you just get that checkerboard background. What it really means is it's transparent. Okay, so what I'm going to do is create. Oh, sorry. What I'm going to do is create another layer. And I'm going to call it white. Got to get my layer dialog box out. Where is it? Oh, it's hiding over here. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to put, here's the white layer, but I didn't do anything with it yet. So I'm going to put it underneath the artwork that we brought in from Illustrator. I'm going to select the whole background. I'm going to do a fill of white. Okay. And then as far as layers go, I'm going to just use what we brought over as a guide. Okay. So I'm going to take it down to like 30%. So I just made it really light. It's just a guide for me now. Okay. And I'm going to switch back and forth between Illustrator. For some reason, I need this. I just selected it, this little green guy there. And I go Command V. And here's the little green thing I just brought over into Photoshop. Now, as you can see, it's a new layer up here. Okay, and I'm going to name it. Come on, baby. Oh, I have to hit this little check. You have to go through the protocol, or otherwise it will not do what you want. Now I can name it. Okay. So what I first brought in is not the artwork I'm going to hand in. I'm going to do this Photoshop piece. And so every piece that I bring in is going to be on a new layer. So I'm going to go over again to Illustrator, pick up another piece. I'm not going to pick up the type. That's going to be on another piece. It's really good to keep your type and your artwork separated because the type changes the most. Push that into position. Okay, and then this time I got to hit the little arrow. There we go. Now it's happy. Let me bring the type over, and that because I would normally keep the type, even if I'm just handing it as a placeholder, you definitely want it to be on another layer. If you gave the artwork to a magazine or a publisher and the type was all in place and they couldn't move it, you'd probably, they can't really change anything then. It causes a lot of Photoshop work to do anything different like that. So here we're going to select our type with the little leader. Hit Command C, Photoshop, Command V. There it is. I'm going to move it into position. I'm going to get rid of this background now. Okay, oh, hit that. Okay, so here's our great piece of art. I have, can you see my little Wacom tablet for the pen? In Photoshop, you can work with a stylus, and with your spiffy new computers, you can work right on the screen. My daughter has this awesome, iPad Pro or whatever, and she can draw right on the screen. It was really amazing. So I have this. Once I'm on these layers, I'm on this. Well, so let me go to the green layer because I named it. I can select it. I use this little selection tool. And then get some white here. I can pick out a tool. I get to a nice size here. Okay, and then, you know, I can do a little highlight. So if I want to make a molecule that way, say I want to pick up some of this green, but I want to darken it up a little bit. Hit OK. And then I can take my tool kind of like that. So as you can see, once it goes down, it's a raster program. So the computer is remembering every little pixel. Okay, and so it's not a recipe for, you know, go this far with white and go that far with green and go this far with dark green. It's remembering every little pixel, which takes a little more memory, which is not such a big deal today, but it doesn't have the editability of Illustrator. But it's still a really fun program. I use Photoshop a lot. It's more of a hand painterly look. If you don't want it to look very dry, you can do a lot more with Photoshop as far as making it look kind of personal and more hand done. You know, I can go up here to, let's see, I deselect, I get Command D, stops the action on that green piece. I'm going to put pink here for the name. Just another way of staying organized. Sometimes these things are kind of little, and with this layers dialog box, if you don't have things named, it might be a little confusing on what's what. But another good thing with these layers is that you have all these different layer effects. So you can do like a drop shadow. And you have all kinds of, I don't like them too dark, but you know, if you want it to look a little more natural. And you see what's going on there as far as the drop shadow. Maybe I may make it a little darker so you can see what's going on there. And then you have all kinds of controls, like how tight you want it to be, how diffused you want it to be. Lots of tools with that. Plus you can still go back and color it. There's other tools like, I don't know if you ever have taken photography where you use a dodge tool. This is kind of like that, where you can lighten it up. Okay, so I'm just like lightening up. Just, you know, a million ways to be creative. There's an eraser tool. Oh, I'm see. Whatever you have, when you have the two colors here, if there's a foreground and a background color. So whatever the background color is, when you erase, that's what it's going to be. That's why it didn't come out white. But like, yeah, now, but see, since I have a drop shadow, the drop shadow is always there. So anything that you erase, you still have a drop shadow because that effect is on. I can take that off. There, I took the drop shadow off. Million tools in Photoshop. It's a lot of fun. Any more questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, like, so you actually went to art school, and myself and a lot of other scientists, like I appreciate art, but I'm not trained in the arts. And so like when I've used Illustrator and programs like that, it's been very functional. So I'm just curious, like, to what degree is it just kind of like intuitive to you in terms of your creativity, or do you have like is it like kind of a science? Do you have like a set of rules that you stick to as well
You
about
mean
like this designing, like the color choice, the shading, the
right,
spacing, that kind of thing?
right. Well, I think you're going to kind of take the lead from the authors as far as the science, protocols when it comes to color choices and that kind of thing. So you're going to want to, really talk to the authors to find out, what they're working with, what it looks like, and you're going to want to play off of that. Now, I'm also, I've got the editor and the art director of the magazine that are overseeing this too. So they're going to have their input on what it is. I normally try to go with something pretty realistic. So, if it's a green plant story, I'm going to really try to go with green. And if I'm working with, a heart tissue story, I'm going to, be looking at heart images and trying to get those colors right. So I'm pretty much into realism, and will try to, take my lead from what's there. If you're into mathematics or something more hypothetical, then the gamut of colors can really come in then, as far as what you want to come into. There was some cells here that I had up. Yeah, these colors were pretty, pretty much, you could have been anything with these cells. So basically, I was just trying to keep a difference, so to make things clear that way, but they weren't really based on reality. But you definitely want to take the lead from the scientist, from the author of the story, and go from there. I mean, a lot of times they won't have a preference, but if you put it out there, it's a starting point, and like I say, you want to be ready to be for changes. And so if I did need to change these colors, I'd be able to do it. Nice thing with Photoshop, you've got different tools in here, and I can go into hue, saturation. This whole thing can change, so that's in the old days when I did things in airbrush, it would take me, I'd have to go home for a week, and change that, and hopefully they like it. But yeah, we can change things really easy. That's the whole thing with the computer programs. It's very, very nice. But as far as design goes, I'm always trying to go with the clearest view I can think of. So I'm not trying to make something like pretty just to be pretty. If it's, especially if it's making it more confusing. I think there's sometimes where maybe I could have done things a little more artistically, for the magazine. But I really try to do it clear, number one. So,
Very interesting. Thanks a lot.
yeah. How about anyone else? Any other questions?
Yes, Libby has a question. Do you want to go ahead and ask it, Libby? I can read it.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much. This has been really informative.
Oh, good. I hope so. Okay.
My question is about some of the animation that you mentioned.
Sure.
So you make the 3D models in a different program and then import them in.
Right.
Does each can you move like parts of an individual model, or does each moving piece need to be its own separate model?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You mostly will have different models for each movement. Now, when you saw this video, these little cells, let's get back. Now that was one model, but you can distort the model in time. So when you're doing the video, this model, I would distort it and move things around. Okay, so but the actual model did move. I didn't have to create a million different models. Like in the old days when people were doing animation, they had to have the guy, every time he would move his hand, it would be another drawing. The computer does all that for you now. So if I said I want this little cell to be 3 inches wide, and then I want it to go down to 1.5 inches wide, and I plot that over time in the video or the 3D program, it'll do that. Now, there's a bit of overlap where I did this in Lightwave, my 3D program, and there's ways to do that in After Effects too. So it's kind of like what you're comfortable with doing. But a lot of these programs, you can do a lot of the same things different ways. So I'm most comfortable with Lightwave. That's my 3D program, and I can set things up in that. But to answer your question, generally, you have a separate model for each thing that moves around. And then unless you're distorting that model itself, that's the time when you would do that. Okay. Does that help?
Mhm. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, we're hitting the hour pretty soon. If there's any quick questions, ask them now. I think this has been overall really great in terms of exposure. Really before meeting you, George, and having you here today, I couldn't even fascinate how many programs there are and how many you use. So I really appreciate that alone. I think it can be intimidating to know where to begin and what programs to just start with. Yeah. So on that, I want to say, yeah, thank you so much again. For anyone who is just starting off in illustration, I think this is a great, subset to see the full exposure. But for those who are like, I'd rather hand it off, George is a great person to work with and talk to. So I really recommend, and his work is very beautiful. And so thank you again so much for working with us and being here today and sharing your work. And so
and I tell you, if you have questions, feel free to email me. I would love to answer any questions and give any guidance I can. Science illustration is a really fun field. It's always changing. You hear about stuff way before it gets on the news, and it's very rewarding. And the programs are always changing. And the art director that I work for, who retired at Scientific American, he now doing these really awesome space scenes that show up on Nova when they're doing any kind of planet shows. So Ed Bell is one of my inspirations. So he's taken video like way off the charts. And, just there's always awesome things. And Jen Christensen that I showed you, the 2D pieces, she does amazing infographics. It's a whole nother beautiful field. So there's a lot of different ways to go, and whatever works for you.
Great. Thank you so much, George. Really
You
wonderful.
bet. Awesome. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I'll go ahead and stop the recording and close the event.